My name is Omid Fotuhi. I'm the Director of Learning and Innovation at WGE Labs and the Director of the College Innovation Network. I love smaller groups because it can really be much more interactive, much more organic. My hope today is to do two things, really. One is to maybe have a conversation and an overview of some of the challenges and barriers that stunt or frustrate the adoption of EdTech. And the other is to showcase what the College Innovation Network has been trying to do to address those common challenges that we've identified as being barriers to the EdTech adoption. So I want to first of all take a moment to thank the Charles Koch Foundation. Without their support, this project would not be here. And so much appreciated to that support. And before I get going, I do want to maybe just start off with a few key insights about learning and about how learning occurs. One of those key insights is that learning is fundamentally a human process. Now, it's important to put that context because we're here to talk about EdTech, technology, as a conduit, as a channel for learning. And over time, there certainly have been temptations or efforts to replace the human component of learning with varying levels of success. I argue that in order to have the truly effective learning, that fundamentally human process needs to be engaged and employed, even if technology continues to be that channel or that conduit for the learning. The other thing that I'll propose, and I'd love feedback or pushback on this, is that our brains are actually designed not simply to store information, but to process information. And the reason why that's important is because we live in a time of incredible amounts of information and access to information. And if we were to rely on our memorization capabilities, then we would be limited by how much we could learn. And so if we think about learning as also our capacity to process and manage information, then that also opens up an understanding of how technology could potentially be leveraged to enhance learning as well. And the third point is that we're certainly seeing an incredible level of acceleration in terms of technology providing greater access to that learning. And so how we are able to think about these fundamental keys of learning together and the role of the technology in supporting that learning is really what this conversation is about. And of course, we'll be talking about the College Innovation Network and how we've been trying to support learning, but you all probably have great insights and expertise in terms of how you've come to approach that challenge as well. We also I think, are familiar with some version of this graph where when COVID occurred, mass adoption to remote learning and technology as the main channel of those learning experiences. And certainly there have been individuals or organizations that have hoped for, claimed that these patterns will be sustained, that learning will continue to be increasingly driven by these technologically driven channels, because that's what we've been able to evolve and innovate. Now that we have access to these technologies, we can expect that the future of learning will continue along that pace and that technology will be the main conduit or channel for learning. While others will argue that really we were forced to adapt to COVID because we had to, and that there are forces of friction in place that without being addressed, we're going to revert back to pre-COVID business as usual, and we're going to see the same old practices be reenacted over again. The question is, for me, and I hope for this group as well, is there anything that we can do potentially to change either of these models? My hope is that we're able to retain some elements from the innovations that were brought out from COVID, the ones that have had a positive impact, the ones that have demonstrated beneficial effects on student learning, and retain those. But my argument is that we will not be able to do that without some form of intervention that basically was preventing greater adoption of a technology pre-COVID. So the question is, why did institutions not adopt technology at a higher pace or with greater fidelity pre-COVID? And if we understand the answer to that question, then maybe we can understand how we can intervene to be able to sustain and integrate technology more effectively post-COVID. In our work, we have worked really hard with post-secondary institutions, with EdTech vendors, with individuals in the space to identify the common barriers that typically institutions confront when they're thinking about adopting technology. We've categorized them into 3 broad categories, which we call market failures. And those basically consist of the lack of trust or the lack of channels to connect with and communicate with solution providers. You talk to any administrator, they will happily tell you about how much they distrust vendors, and how much they're inundated with aggressive marketing tactics and sales tactics, how they ignore innovators who are there really seemingly to help them, support them with their students' learnings. But because they're fatigued, because there's a lack of trust, that connection doesn't happen. There's also an interesting and unfortunate consequence of all of this, which is that if there isn't trust for younger, more innovative companies, then the default is to rely on the well-established big players in the field. And that is not innovative. That is not a part of the mechanism that can really create more tailored solutions. And so how is it that we can rebuild that trust, especially with those earlier stage companies who are motivated to learn to create solutions that really are tailored to institutions' needs? But there is that barrier. There's a lack of trust, and so the default is to rely on the big players to do the same kinds of jobs that we've always had accomplished. The second main category of challenge is the challenges to implementation. And those have to do with basically if you know what you need, what solution you need, if you know what vendor provides that solution, how then do you implement that effectively? When we first started this work with the College Innovation Network, we thought it would be sort of a bandwidth constraint with an IT personnel or administrators not having enough access or leverage with their faculty to implement this in a consistent and confident way. But what we've learned is that the main bottleneck is not in technology expertise or resources. It has more to do with the opting in of the key constituents and the key stakeholders. So the users of those technologies are just resistant to change. And so when you think about implementation, it's not about are there adequate artifacts that helps institutions implement them effectively. It's more about how is it that you can foster a culture that is open to innovation and experimentation with new products that will ultimately lead to the adoption that's necessary. And the third area, which we'll be talking about as well in more detail, are the challenges to research. So let's say you know what product you need, you know what product what company to connect with, you know how to implement it. How do you know if that's effective? One of the things that we've learned amidst COVID, and we've known a long time as well, is that those institutions who have the greatest need for more innovative solutions are often the ones that are the most resource constrained. And so if they make an investment, they have to have demonstrated ROIs that demonstrates and shows them that they are having the impact that they need. Because if they're going to spend $1, they need to demonstrate that that dollar is having a beneficial impact. And so when it comes to evaluation, one of the main challenges with EdTech is in classic sort of gold standard research, there isn't an adequate comparison group. Oftentimes when there is an EdTech solution that's introduced, it's delivered to all students all at once. And so while there may be qualitative content and data that says that students are using it, and when you ask them, they say it's really great, but there's no comparison group to be able to demonstrate whether the introduction of that new product compared to a similar population of students is having the beneficial effects that you need. And so there's also that component of the challenges to research that is one of the main hurdles to overcome. So I will be spending some time going into more detail into these categories, and again, that's where the main focus of today's conversation is. I do also just want to, so those are the 3 categories. Before we get into that, I want to highlight another domain of challenge that we're all susceptible to, and that has to do with the mindset of innovation. If I were to ask this group, what does innovation mean to you? Does anyone feel like they want to offer a definition? If anyone's qualified to say it, I think this room's probably pretty well suited. What is innovation? There's no wrong answers. Well, there are, but I'm not gonna. I'm not gonna give you one. What is innovation? Who wants to share a
Creativity.
Creativity. Thank you. Any others?
Looking for new ways to do things that can be like where you see gain. So greater efficiency, greater productivity. So
Great. Any others? So I really appreciate those definitions. They're very much in line where I'm headed with this. Unfortunately, it's not always the way that innovation is thought about for a lot of varying reasons. When it comes to EdTech, one of the challenges is that there's this huge burden of expectation that technology will solve all the problems all at once for all students. And in part, it has to do with those who are trying to make their products available. They tend to demonstrate or at least represent their products and solutions as being potentially quite impactful, as being the solution that institutions need to solve a particular problem. And so there is this sort of charismatic narrative when it comes to technology that it is in itself a means to an end, and that's the way to think about innovation. The challenge is when we do that, there are limitations in terms of how far we can go with that. As I've mentioned, some of the challenges that ensue, or the consequences that ensue, is that there is this growing distrust between vendors and institutions, and that when you make the promise that a product is the solution, what happens after that, right? So you kind of are setting yourself up for arriving at a dead end, and that might be limiting as well. Justin Reich, who wrote the book Failure to Disrupt, Why Technology Alone Cannot Transform Education, talks about this charismatic machine when he says that technology can improve learning at scale, but charismatic storytelling about the learning technologies distorts the conditions for success and overlooks the common points of failures. And what that's underpinning is really the core of what innovation can be, which is a process. And when we talk about our products as being the solution, then we're underselling the potential for collaboration with institutions. We're potentially limiting the way that we can serve institutions because we convey to them that we have a product that is the solution that they need. And it also robs us of the opportunities for collaborative improvement, right? If we present a solution as this finished, polished product, then what processes are we putting into place to get feedback to improve those products and ultimately better serve the students that we hope to serve with those solutions? And so again, all of these patterns do lend themselves to greater distrust between vendors and solution providers. One of the things that we do with the College Innovation Network, which really quickly is a funded project to bring together a network of post-secondary institutions where we help to support the EdTech adoption, implementation, and evaluation of tailored solutions for those schools. And one of the things that we do as part of the College Innovation Network is we invest a fair bit of time and effort in brokering the relationships between institutions and vendors by first doing a couple of things, working with institutions to understand what their own needs are, but then also sourcing the marketplace to identify vendor providers who offer solutions for those needs, but then they're also open and committed to more of a partnership rather than a product delivery relationship. And how we do that is we have a pretty structured and rigorous selection process that has these components. We want to ensure that the product providers do have some sort of demonstrated social impact framework, that they are committed to doing social good in addition to developing innovative products, that they have mission alignment with innovation and continuous improvement, that they have a demonstrated empirical basis for the claims that they make, and that they have both strong implementation support, but as well as this sort of mindset of collaboration and openness to sharing the findings that come out of the collaboration. Because at the heart of what we think is important to remind the network of schools that we represent, and currently there are 12 of those schools, is that no product will solve all of your problems, but rather the process itself is the solution. And I will say really quickly that this spirit of innovation is something that a lot of schools are really appreciating. Because they have been sold the model of thinking that one product will solve their problems. But when they understand that they can engage and commit to a process of continuous improvement, then they're better able to understand that there is no endpoint, that really ultimately investing in the mechanisms and the channels of understanding how these things are implemented and evaluated is the solution in itself. And that also opens up a lot of opportunity for a lot more tinkering, a lot more improvement for the products and the outcomes for the students as well. So what I'm now going to do is basically go over again those three main categories of friction and pain points for schools when it comes to adopting the EdTech products that they need. And what was most, I think, surprising to us when we began this work, and we started having conversations with schools, and we asked them, what are the solutions that you need? We found that a lot of them had this blank look on their face. They had no clue. They certainly had a lot of talking points that they would often share within leadership meetings or within meetings with us, but they had no clear mechanism to understand what their students' actual needs were. And so what we realize is that most institutions have no idea what their students' needs are or how to go about actually understanding what those students' needs are. And that this lack of awareness of what their own needs are also meant that they didn't know what solutions are out there. As I've mentioned, there's a good select number of key players in the marketplace that have a pretty strong dominance in terms of what solutions they offer, but there isn't an understanding of some of the more early stage companies that have more innovative solutions. And so that lack of understanding of what's out there is also one of the barriers. And I think reasonably there's no way that we can expect schools to actually have the insight into the marketplace. And so the question is, who can play that role for schools to better support them to access those solutions? And then the third one has to do with just both the vendors, and I'll be honest, both the vendors and the institutions articulating either both what they are offering and what the institutions need. So if you go to most vendor websites, you'll find something along the lines of, we create a product that serves to benefit students. Without going into too much detail of exactly how they do that. So no wonder schools are having a hard time deciphering what these companies are providing. And at the same time, because schools don't know what they need, they also don't know how to articulate what they need so that vendors can serve those needs. So these frictions in the EdTech marketplace are some of the areas that we recognize as being an area that we could better serve. And so when we put together the College Innovation Network, we created a collaboration where we brought together the key administrators across a network of schools to engage in a process of understanding what their core needs are so that we can then match them with the vendor solutions that are out there. In essence, what we're trying to do is support these schools to lighten the burden of EdTech implementation and evaluation. One of the ways, as I've mentioned, that we try to do this is to organize and connect the schools to those solutions that are in the marketplace. We have a pretty well-structured process that we follow, and that has to do with, again, beginning at its heart with understanding what the school's needs are. Once we understand that, we run it through our cycle of sourcing, iterating and validating, and then scaling and sharing. So we work with the startups and nonprofits and researchers to help identify the solutions that are out there. We think about how we can implement those solutions and then iterate in a way that helps to enhance the implementation. And then also, once we've evaluated the efficacy of those products, we take those insights and share it across the network, but also beyond the network as well. So we hope to serve not only the network institutions, but also be a representative of the insights that we capture through this network to post-secondary institutions across the nation. As a demonstration of how this process actually unfolds, in our first convening of the key administrators across the College Innovation Network institutions, we brought together those key administrators and we facilitated a conversation through design thinking to help them understand the set of priorities and needs that they are currently facing. And these were themes that they were considering and confronting during the dawn of COVID. And in that design process, we identified a fair number of themes that they thought were relevant. But through this design process, we were able to hone in on those that were both high priority and high urgency, and focus on those as the next steps. And as you can see, we landed last year on 4 key domains of need that institutions articulated as being something that they were concerned about. The first one had to do with access and equity. So given this the transition into remote learning, how is it that we can continue to deliver quality learning experiences to all students in an equitable and accessible way? They knew this was an issue. They didn't know how to address it, but that was one of the themes that surfaced that then became the mission for the College Innovation Network to try to support. The second is, as remote learning is now and social distancing is the norm, how is it that we can engage students if we don't have the traditional face-to-face opportunities for interaction that were available to us before? And so thinking about technology, again, to facilitate that human experience is one of the challenges and the themes that we landed on. The third had to do with faculty readiness. So this was pushed upon all faculty to now teach everything online. But had we put into place the resources and the training to make sure that they're ready? And most institutions answered no, and the faculty agreed. And yet we still got through this one way or the other, and we have some data later to show that we didn't do that great of a job. And so the students themselves, for those schools that didn't have in place the structures to support faculty to teach online, had a worse experience through COVID than those who did. And then the fourth one had to do with being able to leverage data in a more timely and responsive way to identify students in need at times of need. And again, the channels of information that were in place pre-COVID were disrupted. And so how do we take advantage of new channels of data in a more timely way to understand which student populations are in need and how we can better serve them? I'm not going to bore you with it, but we did develop a pretty sophisticated matching algorithm. Once we knew what the major needs of the institutions were, we ran it through our matching algorithm to see what solution providers were out there to optimize that connection between the institution's personalized needs and the providers that were in the marketplace that not only offered those solutions, but also demonstrated that collaborative spirit that we knew was necessary to make this an ongoing continuous improvement effort. And so just a more recent representation of how that process again was put into place. In our last convening, which occurred about a month ago, interestingly enough, we conducted the same process but landed on fewer areas of need, which it consisted of student engagement and student support services. I think out of COVID, we learned a lot in terms of how to do remote learning, but what we realized is that we're not fully supporting students and we're still not engaging students. And given the uncertainties of whether we will go back to in-person or not, these are the looming questions. I'll also say that sort of a sub-theme that we picked up on across all the institutions was a greater sense of uncertainty. Even though pre-COVID, we had a lot of uncertainty, at least schools know that their next target was how to provide learning for students through remote channels. There was clarity on there. But now, as we emerge post-COVID, we know that students now have had a taste for remote learning as well as pre-COVID for more traditional learning, and they have now a preference for a little bit of both. And so institutions who are trying to meet that more flexible hybrid model don't really know how to invest. Do they go full board with investing in online and remote learning channels and platforms, or do they expect that students will come back to in-person and that's where they should invest their dollars? So there was a lot more uncertainty this year than we had picked up on in previous year. And so our task with the College Innovation Network is to see how we can, again, take those insights and source the marketplace to find the solutions that address those needs. I've mentioned the second category of challenges that have to do with implementation challenges. And as I've also alluded to, oftentimes those implementation challenges are not technical in nature, but they are sort of more the challenges that have to do with buy-in and change management. One of the things that we know is when it comes to faculty being influenced in terms of how they teach and what resources and tools they use to teach, is that the primary source of influence for what they do are other teachers. And if you understand that and you're trying to introduce a new solution or a new product, how is it that you can best introduce that is by identifying that small subgroup of teachers who really are the innovators. And we've all sort of seen a version of this adoption model, this normal curve, where you have that small minority of innovators who are constantly open to experimentation, who are constantly tinkering with new tools, ways to improve their learning and their teaching, and are open to taking new tools and adapting them into their classroom. Then you have another small minority who are the early adopters. So let's say the innovators find one or two products that they like. The early adopters are like, great, I'm in. But the vast majority of the faculty are quite resistant. And unless you are able to fully engage this small minority group of faculty, then the later groups of individual faculty are not going to change their practices without first seeing strong evidence that there is efficacy with a smaller group of faculty. And so if we understand that this is the process of adoption, then there are ways in which institutions can understand to embed strategies and support to elevate those early adopting faculty, to give them the platform to showcase what they're trying out, so that adoption model does end up manifesting itself. And so as we've been working with institutions and we're thinking about how is it that we can take products that are in the marketplace and help the implementation process, we've really created the opportunities to elevate the faculty and give them the platforms that they need to showcase what they've learned so that the rest of the faculty community can take those solutions and apply them in their own classrooms. So that's one of the offshoot services that we've been investing time into, and supporting faculty and administrators in thinking about where are the areas in which they can inject some greater support. So when we work with administrators, we ask where can you intervene in this process of experiment, experience, and plan that could support and elevate faculty along those adoption processes. The last category of challenges that I've mentioned has to do with evaluation. And that really is what the College Innovation Network was founded to do. But in order to get here, we've recognized that we needed to address the first two categories of challenges. Otherwise, we'd never have anything to actually evaluate because it's not being implemented effectively. But even when you do get there and you do have a product that it can be evaluated, how do you do that effectively? And we've put a lot of time into it, but basically because we have a quasi-experimental design through a network of schools, so we have 12 institutions, we're able to recommend solutions that address common needs and introduce those solutions to one campus, but not to another campus with similar populations of students. And so therefore we have that comparison group that we were talking about. In addition, we've also recognized that times are changing and students' needs are evolving constantly. So what are the channels that we can create and put into place to have that continuous understanding of what students' needs are so that we can report that back to the schools, which will then inform the EdTech adoption sourcing and implementation that is crucial to what we're doing. What I'm going to share with you over the next few slides are the results of an EdTech survey that we just developed and implemented a couple of months ago. And those had to do with the students' experiences with EdTech products during COVID. What were those experiences like? What were the factors that predicted better utilization? And what were the challenges of EdTech when it came to students' experiences? This was a survey that was implemented. It was delivered to 10,000 students. A fair number of them completed it. We had representation from both traditional institutions, but also those who had some online offerings already. And so I'll share with you a few key insights or findings. I'm happy to chat more about some of the additional findings that we found. But just to give you a quick glance at what we found, even though equity and access was a theme, we found that there were still persisting challenges of inequity when it came to EdTech solutions. That while most students did have some sort of access to needed EdTech, that students of color were significantly less likely than whites on average to have access and ownership of the basic hardware and software needed to access their learning experiences. And so this was one of the insights that we know will be the basis for more work with our network institutions to make sure that the access is there. If we expect the students to access learning, but the channels aren't there, then you're basically not going to get there. We also asked students, given this taste of online learning, what do you want moving forward? And we found that a good third of the population of students that transitioned to online learning actually liked it. They want more online experiences and more online learning options, even as they return back to in-class, in-person instruction. However, there was a limitation to that because they also still wanted the in-person traditional experience and would not consider enrolling in a school if it went fully online. I'll note really quickly that these were students who had come from traditionally in-person, so there was already some reason why they chose those offerings, but to hear that they did actually have a preference for both online and remote is one of those insights that we're going to be sharing with the institutions, but also with the vendors who are trying to create those solutions that serve those students' needs. Another area of insight that we thought was pretty powerful is that we stumbled across a whole new construct. That one of the strongest predictors of how students actually fared during COVID was how much self-efficacy they had with just engaging and accessing technology. So this EdTech self-efficacy was a construct that we didn't know was out there, but we learned was a core predictor of how well students did. It predicted whether or not they had any difficulty keeping up with their learning. It enhanced their learning experience during the academic year. Students who had greater self-efficacy, EdTech self-efficacy, were more likely to report that learning the course material effectively is something that they were able to do. They were more likely to report feeling prepared for the next steps in their educational journey. They're more likely to want more online learning options. They're more likely to report having access to educational technologies needed for their courses. So being prepared and having a sense of efficacy also meant that they were more likely to seek out the channels and resources that were there to help them access their learning. The converse is that if they were they had less EdTech self-efficacy, they were more likely to report that most of the EdTech they used was new to them. They were less likely to report that EdTech enhanced their learning experience. They were less likely to report that learning the course material, they were able to learn it effectively. They were less likely to report the use of EdTech in their classes and said that it was actually felt invasive. So if you didn't feel prepared, it felt invasive. They're more likely to report that they felt less connected to their peers and more likely to report that they would consider not enrolling for the next academic year if they didn't have that level of self-efficacy to use EdTech. And again, this is an insight that's pretty powerful for both institutions and the providers. If you're trying to implement a new product, making sure that there is a skill set there that is first addressed, again, helps with that implementation that can serve students. So I'll pause there. Again, wanted to thank the Charles Koch Foundation for the support that made this possible. I welcome any interaction and engagements. If you have any questions with what we're doing with the College Innovation Network, I'd love to connect with you. We are a fully funded project. We're growing linearly each year. In our first cohort, we had 6 schools. Our second cohort, we just introduced another 6 schools, and we hope to continue to scale this on a linear fashion moving forward. And then we think that as we grow the network out, we're also able to create a platform where we can draw out key insights from a representative group of institutions that can inform the entire marketplace. And so we're pretty excited about this work. Would love to hear your feedback or if you have any questions, but I'll pause there. The other thing I'll say is if you are interested, we do have a copy of our annual report that summarizes a lot of what I shared. So feel free to help yourself. Yes?
I have 2 questions.
There's a mic that, yes.
Oops.
Go
Hi.
ahead. Hi.
Can you hear me?
I think the
Oh.
video is picking it up. Yeah.
Oh, okay. The question about whether students prefer to go back online or go face-to-face, it was kind of split right down the middle, like 34%, 32%. Did you have a question in there about whether they would want the hybrid option, so like partly in class and then partly in class, some online? And then my second question is, you said you have a number of schools you work with. Do those schools pay you a fee for your services?
Yeah, great question. So we had the preferences for either online or in person as separate questions. And to your point, we found sort of endorsement of both. And surprisingly, we didn't find that it was an and or. So students who said, I want more online, were also more likely to say, I also want the in person. So there was a desire for more of that combined effort. There wasn't a question that specifically asked about hybrid. A lot of students actually don't really know what hybrid models are, so that's one of the reasons why we didn't include it. The other question that you had is, are schools paying into the College Innovation Network? Because of the funding that we've had, we have not charged a single cent of any of the institutions that we've accepted so far. In fact, we've gone as far, because of COVID and not having the cost of an in-person convening, we saved a fair bit of money, and we actually offset the cost of the solutions that they licensed as part of this pilot evaluation. So we've been quite privileged, I'd say, in terms of having that support. I will also mention that that's part of our model of sustainability. We intentionally targeted schools that were under-resourced and had a policy of inclusion and accessibility through their enrollment policies. Because we knew that they served the groups of student populations that had the greatest potential of benefiting from these innovations. And so we are intentional with the schools that we recruit, and we're mindful of the limitations that there are, financial limitations that are in place. So we're continuing to seek out funding, and hopefully we'll have continued funding to do this. Yes, thank you.
As you know, a potential startup that did contact you guys at WGE Labs for your accelerator program, I noticed on your matrix that our specific focus was bottom left instead of top right.
Right.
And even though we are picking up significant traction, is that going to be a difficulty in aligning with you guys?
Great question. So we just finished the onboarding of the new schools. With that, we're trying to build out greater awareness of the solutions that are out there. What we hope to do is to take the insights that we gleaned from this convening and this process of needs assessment that we've developed, take that back to the schools so they understand what the key areas of common challenges are, and from there have a conversation around what are the additional needs that you have. We are on the back end building out as much understanding of what's out there. In fact, starting next week, we're going to be opening up the RFI for vendors. I would encourage you to go to our website, fill that out, let us know what you're offering, and then how that can be made available to the College Innovation Network institutions. What we're moving towards is not just an evaluation project, but really creating a transformative model in which EdTech products and partnerships are engaged in. We hope to be the brokers that creates more trust between institutions and vendors by facilitating that connection. And once we've created that connection, we want to step out of the way and let you all do the great work that you do and serve those institutions. Because I think what we know is that institutions just don't recognize how committed vendors are to really creating the solutions that they need and that benefit their students. But because of that sort of closed door, there often isn't the opportunities to have those conversations. So we're trying to create platforms. The other thing I'll say is we're working towards creating or putting into place a conference or convening next year that basically does that. Bring in the vendors and the institutions to have a conversation around what are our needs and how can we address them? Because I think that's sort of what's been missing as well. Yeah, great question. Yes.
Have you, going by your adaptation cycle, have you seen a method of success getting the instructors on board to the innovation, the new ideas that are in? Because part of our problem when we did PD and everything prior to COVID, nobody wanted to hop on board. Then once COVID hit, it's like, oh, I need to learn this, and then it was like the later phase, like, oh, this is really good. I wish I would have hopped on earlier, and then the other ones were just way off. So have you seen any method to get them on board to the cycle so it's not as painful and we don't have to go through another crisis for them to hop on?
Yeah, great question. And it's one of those core thorns that we all have to confront, whether you're a parent and trying to get your kids to eat their food, or administrator trying to get faculty to adopt new practices. But what we do know is that understanding the adoption mechanisms and seeing what promotes greater adoption through peer influence is important to be focused on. How we hope to serve to accelerate adoption cycles is by giving the faculty more of a platform, so they are invited to that next convening. They are part of the conversation. The other thing that we've noticed is that some of the schools that we've partnered with are so small that they feel that they're part of something bigger by being part of the College Innovation Network. And so when they're engaging the faculty and saying, hey, would you try this out? They know that they're actually part of a larger pilot project that has a potential impact on the entire marketplace. So those are mechanisms that we put into place to encourage more adoption, and then working closely with administrators. So while we're very, very selective with our vendors, we're also even more selective with the institutions that we select. Because it's fully funded, we can be quite selective. We have a long list of criteria for those institutions, which includes key involvement from a senior leadership member throughout the entire cycle. That includes monthly convenings and calls where they are connected to these conversations. And so because we have their ears and their collaboration, and that they know they're part of this bigger project, they also understand how they can understand these adoption cycles and support their faculty, especially in the early adoption stages, to better implement this work. The last thing I'll say is because we end with an evaluation, and that's a report we're going to give back to the institutions, that in itself will also be motivating for those faculty who tried new approaches. And even those who didn't will now have the basis to say, I have confidence that maybe this does work for my students. It's a great question. Yes? Sorry, was there someone else?
Along with that question, how has any sort of reward system or gamification, has that, I know that a lot of people are trying it, right, and to increase motivation in another way. What has been the research, or has anybody brought that up as an additional motivating factor, as not necessarily like money or anything like that, but just some sort of showcasing, best practices, or showcasing the people that have done a good job at implementing it? Has that been an additional motivating factor at increasing adoption?
Yeah, great question. And you're sort of forecasting what we see the vision of CIN 2 years down the line. What we've done so far is understand what institutions are articulating as being their needs, and we've put into place a mechanism that helps them understand that. So we don't just have conversations with them. We have LXDs, the user designers, that go onto those campuses, have interviews with faculty, with students, with staff, to get a good representation of what their needs are. And then that informs the needs assessment process and the matching process that we have. Now we're getting at a point where we have enough institutions that we're starting to get an adequate sample where we think the needs that we've highlighted are relatively representative of the needs across the United States. Where we're going to be in 2 years is we'll have enough of a sample of the kinds of solutions that we can also inform what kinds of insights you're getting at. So what solutions do or don't work? How are they timed, and how are they implemented to enhance the way that they work? And so that is at the core of our evaluation mission, and that's what we're moving towards. But I would invite you to, again, connect with us and let us know what solutions or thoughts or research you have, because that will inform ultimately the value of the College Innovation Network, which is to serve the knowledge base of how EdTech really can support student learning. But that's 2 years down the line. Yeah, great question. Yes?
Is the primary focus of the evaluation, the reporting on the classroom and the technologies utilized within the classroom? Or are you guys also looking at student experience outside of the classroom and what's being utilized there?
Absolutely, yeah. And we'll go wherever the need is. And that's both challenging, but also ultimately what we're banking will be how we can best serve the institutions. And where we've learned the need is really all across both the classroom but also beyond as well. How is it that you can support faculty to better deliver the courses? How is it that you can offer essential supportive services for students in addition to their classroom experiences? How is it that you can leverage data to better understand what the evolving and emerging needs of the student populations are? So it certainly spans across any and all domains that could be relevant. And then where we can either match to existing solution providers or in-house build the solutions to support those needs. So I'll very quickly mention that one of the emerging themes that's emerged, and we've invested some time and energy in being able to support that, is better data analytics. A lot of these schools sit on a wealth of data but have no idea how to access it or how to basically synthesize and understand it. So we put together what we're calling Measure Ed, data analytics set of services to help those schools understand what their own students' needs are, which will also inform how they can serve those needs.
Who are you talking to when you talk to institutions? Because there's, many institutions, maybe it's the size of the institution I'm thinking about, because a lot of institutions will have a whole bunch of people who do EdTech and promote certain technologies with faculty.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems to be you're going from the IT folks straight to faculty, or I'm just wondering.
Yeah, great.
Because there's whole networks like the New Media Consortium, for example, that promote all sorts of like different types of technologies. So the kinds of services you offer are out there in various ways.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. And I'd love feedback on this. I will say that we've done two things intentionally, maybe to our own demise, I'm not sure. But we have been intentional in the schools that we've selected as being as diverse as possible from each other. And the reason why we've done that is because we think that if we have as diverse a set of schools as possible, then we'll have the best representation of the most diverse student populations that are out there. So we have anything from like small, really small community colleges to technical colleges to hybrid colleges that give us the perspective of as many different kinds of students' needs as possible. How we've been engaging with those schools, as I've mentioned, is because we expect a relatively rapid phase of iteration. We insist that there be at least one representative from the senior leadership that is the liaison for the College Innovation Network partnership. In addition, they bring on key stakeholders that are relevant to each conversation. So if we're doing implementation, they're going to bring in their IT person. If we're bringing evaluation, they're going to bring their student academics director. Because they have the leverage to include key stakeholders, we found that to be a model that's worked pretty well so far, though I'm not sure if it's the only model. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, so really love the presentation. I'll
Thank you.
probably follow up with you
I
afterwards.
appreciate it. Thank you.
My question is, coming from the institution side, one of the biggest questions or dilemmas that we have is, when do you partner with an outside ed tech company, or when do you go for an in-house solution? Because institutions do have tremendous resources and tremendous brain power, honestly. So has your research touched on that issue at all? And if so, I'd love to hear some results.
Yeah, we're pretty agnostic to the source of the provider. In fact, we have a couple of schools that do have some in-house solutions that we've been trying to promote and support in being developed in a more rigorous way. And because they have access to the network, not only are they able to introduce it on their student populations, but if it's relevant to another school, we'll promote it at the same level as an existing provider that's out in the marketplace. So we're agnostic to who is providing the solution. If the solution is innovative and relevant to the needs assessment process that we have, then we will bring it into the fold. I'll mention when the solutions are not available, or either in-house or in the marketplace, we also have the capacity within WGE Labs to put our designers to the task of creating those solutions. One solution that was missing in the marketplace that we uncovered in our work was that while students may have some access to essential services like tutoring or mental health, there was a lot of negative experience when they actually went to access those essential services. So two things. When they go to find out about it, they usually land on a web page, a static web page, where there's a long list of these services. And then they have to scroll through and then self-identify the area of need that they have. Now, that's psychologically stigmatizing, both because it's overwhelming and also because they have to admit that they're somehow deficient, that they're somehow struggling. And psychologically, we know that that's actually the basis for disengagement. So the model that these schools have been relying on is to assume that students will know how to engage when they're feeling threatened, which psychologically is not supported. So what we're trying to do is to address those barriers by creating almost like a Netflix referral mechanism where students are able to fill out a series of questions, and then they're basically recommended a set of services that we know on average either serve the entire student population in addition to the tailored solutions that they can benefit from. And on top of that, when they do see those recommended solutions, they also see how many other students have actually accessed those. So if they think about mental health or counseling as a service that they need, they don't think like that they're the only person in the world who needs to access it, because they actually have data to support that. And so we're trying to mitigate the psychology that actually causes students to disengage by creating a more engaging essential services platform for institutions, which we haven't found an existing provider to be able to do effectively. So
Can I ask a follow-up
Of course,
question
yeah.
real quick?
Yeah, of course.
So the second and final question here is, you know, your model assumes, or it almost seems like a prerequisite even for engagement, kind of a high-level buy-in to a collaborative, iterative process.
Yeah.
And that has just not been my experience.
I know.
You know, on the institution side. So do you see that as kind of the only way for success, or are there other ways to engage in EdTech
There
adoption?
probably are. I will say that one thing that we could not be more happy with is how selective we were with the institutions we chose. I agree. Not all institutions will want this, but we intentionally chose those institutions that had someone at the leadership that really bought into this mission of innovation. Innovation is a process. And if you're going to evolve and better serve your students' evolving needs, you need to be bought into this network that will give you the greatest confidence that the insights and the needs that you uncover are representative not only on your school, but across the network of schools. So there's a great deal of recognition that there is some value here. It may not be relevant for all schools, but the network that we've created is founded upon the premise that there is that spirit of innovation as a foundation. Yeah. Oh, okay. Great, yeah, sorry, I tend to talk too much.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So I wonder if you've studied at all how this might extend into the K-12 market, and particularly thinking of institutions work with high schools in dual and concurrent enrollment. And then I think related to all of this, I mean, have you thought about, are there any policy solutions that could help move the market along a little more quickly towards overcoming some of these obstacles that you've talked about?
So yes and yes. So we actually just onboarded a new director of research, and she is very savvy and connected to the K-12 space. So she will be joining CIN to see how we can expand what we're doing to the K-12 space. We've only been, thank you so much, in operation for 2 years, and we see the potential and the needs, honestly. In our first year, right as COVID occurred, we had to do a little bit of juggling to find the first 6 schools that we wanted to onboard. In the second year, we had over 30 applicants within a first week of making this public. And we had to turn down the vast majority of them because we didn't have the resources to support them. So there is this understanding that there is a need and a recognition for this set of services. And especially as we think about K-12, there's no reason why that wouldn't be the case as well. I'm sorry, what was your second question?
Just related to policy.
Yeah, so policy, I think, recognizing that assuming that institutions alone can navigate EdTech on their own is a faulty assumption. So I would say, what are the resources that we can put into place to support brokers of that match, of that connection? And then also, how is it that we can better put the solutions to the charge of demonstrating impact. So the evaluation of those solutions, not just because there's a convincing salesperson who is able to convince an administrator, or that qualitatively the students actually use the product, but is it having the intended impact that they claim it will? So those would be the 2 policy recommendations I would think about. Yeah. But I'll stop there. Thank you all.